Welcome, everyone. If we haven't already met, my name is Michelle Zaldivar. I'm your program coordinator here at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. Before we officially get started today, let's do a couple of student announcements. First of all, make sure you take a moment to sign in. Our QR code is right there in that share screen, or you can follow the Go link in the chat, the short link in the chat. Medallion students, a reminder that TTR is always 1 point. Make sure that you take a screenshot of your sign-in so that you can fill out your points log and submit those for review. Honor students, that also counts for you. This is always 1 point. If you want to learn more about the Global Learning Medallion or any of our programs, including PC Prep and Millennium Fellowship, please feel free to shoot us an email at glmedal@fiu.edu. Also, Extension transformation contest. The deadline has officially been extended until this Sunday, February 6th. You can win a trip to Washington, D.C. by sharing your international or intercultural experience in any form that you feel most comfortable, artistic or informational. If you have questions at all, feel free to send me an email at mickzaldi@fiu.edu. More information can be found at go.fiu.edu/GL contest. That QR code will also take you to that Go link. Transformation contest still extended. Student Leadership Conference is coming up at the end of this week on February 5th. If you haven't already signed up, it is a full day of sessions with speakers from all over the FIU community. Erica or David, are you guys doing any Leadership Summit sessions this week?
We are on Saturday at 1:15. I am moderating a panel of our Pride Student Union student leaders. So you'll get to hear from them on everything from the student perspective on how to be a leader here at FIU and specifically supporting marginalized student populations.
Beautiful. So panel for Pride leadership there. There's also a couple of GLMers that are doing a panel along with our program director or assistant director, Jayne, at 1:15. Oh, that conflicts, doesn't it? You find where you fit best,
flip a coin.
And all of those things can support you, and we're all here together. But that's happening this February 5th. That is this Saturday. If you've gotten to your sign-in and you've realized that you've hit a wall and you're like, oh, I need to be subscribed to the New York Times to be able to access this article, guess what? As an FIU community member with an @fiu.edu email, you have a free subscription to the New York Times. If you haven't already accessed it, you can go to accessnyt.com and you can activate your subscription. More information if you are maybe off campus or you're hitting a couple of walls and not able to access a subscription at goglobal.fiu.edu/students/NYT partnership. That information can give you some workarounds if you're hitting a couple of difficulties getting that subscription. I'm going to hand it over to our senior program coordinator, Ms. Sherry Beeson, to do some introductions for our panelists and our panel leader, Sherry.
For sure. Thanks you guys for being here today. It looks like we've got a great crowd and more are joining us every moment. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. Erica Jayne Friedman, who is thrilled to be here at FIU, bringing from New York over 10 years of higher education experience. Friedman's vision is to empower students to take the lead in administering Pride Center campus events. They hope to evolve the culture at FIU through advocacy and education to establish our campus as the most supportive and affirming university for LGBTQIA+ students in Florida. Dr. Friedman is the Associate Director for the Pride Center and the Interim Director for the Women's Center in the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion here at FIU. A native New Yorker, they received their bachelor's in psychology from Binghamton University and earned their PhD in social and personality psychology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Through their research, they examined topics within gender and queer studies focused on understanding the impact of cisgenderism and heterosexism and other intersectional experiences. Dr. Friedman applies lessons from this work to the talks and workshops they give within and outside of LGBTQIA+ communities. They experience their gender as fluid and welcome all pronouns. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Erica Friedman.
I didn't unmute. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining this conversation today. With everything that we do in the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion, we always like to start off our events with a land acknowledgement. I'm going to put that here in the chat so that those who need to read through it can do so as I read through it. Florida International University acknowledges that our institution is located on the ancestral homelands of sovereign Native nations, including the Tequesta, the Calusa, and today the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians, the elders past and present, by fully recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, as well as the historical and contemporary relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. It is within our responsibility as an academic institution to uphold knowledge about the history of FIU with the original stewards of this land that we live, learn, and work on. We encourage our university community to read and learn about ways to support our local Indigenous communities and their efforts to preserve Seminole and Miccosukee land rights, cultural practices, and aid them in the conversation of our environment. And you can go to indigenous.fiu.edu to learn more. So with that, I wanted to first off talk a little bit about some basically some ground rules for how we're going to go about today. So this is a panel discussion, but we also really want to have this be interactive and get input from students. So some ground rules to go off of is welcome discomfort. These are hard topics to talk about. They can make us feel uncomfortable because they can make us kind of start focusing on ourselves and areas where maybe we've made mistakes before, maybe we haven't been as knowledgeable about something before. And like, that's okay. Like, that's a part of the process. Learning is a process and discomfort is a part of that process. So we challenge you to welcome that discomfort and sit in it and learn from it. Ask questions. I always am happy to be interrupted. I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues here, but I'm fine. If you have a question, you want to interrupt me or throw it in the chat, we'll get to it. There is absolutely no judgments in this space. You ask a question the way you need to ask it, how you know how to ask it. And then we will engage you from there and maybe suggest a different way of asking a question in the future. So it's a little more inclusive or a little more sensitive to different cultures. So just remember, we're all learning in this space. What happens in this space is a part of that learning process. So we're going to give grace to each other in that learning process. And then finally, I know this is being recorded, will be posted. So there's not really much confidentiality here, but I do want to just say that typically when we do workshops that are in closed spaces, things are confidential. And I think anyone who's tuning into this conversation, even at a later date, just know, we're sharing, details about our lives in some cases and about our own experiences. So just, have some respect for that and understand that that is something for you to process and to keep, in these kinds of spaces and conversations. I also wanted to acknowledge that it is the first day of Black History Month today. So check out BSU FIU on Instagram. They have posted all of their events for this month, which we have a few that are coming up. We have the Miami Black Women's Forum happening on the 25th all day in the ballrooms. And lots of other really exciting things. Pride Center is doing Black Brilliance on the 23rd of the month up at BBC campus. So check things out, join us for more conversations during Black History Month. And it's also the Lunar New Year today. Happy Lunar New Year to everybody. It is the year of the water tiger. So now I would like to pass the mic over to my colleagues and have them introduce themselves, tell a little bit about who they are and their role in the office. I got like a whole long description read about me, so please say as much as you would like to say about yourselves, starting with David.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am David Bynes, serve as the director for the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion. Still fairly a newbie at FIU. having started here in October of 2021. Most recently, I was at Florida Atlantic University, right up the road. I go by the pronouns he, him, and his. And as far as just a little bit more about me, I am a PhD student pursuing my doctorate degree in curriculum and instruction, and grounded or rooted in race and race relations. Awesome to be here today.
Thanks, David. Rose?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Hi. I just requested that the live transcription be enacted just in case anybody has any challenges. I know that it's helpful to me, just how I'm set up. I am a program manager within the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion. I particularly support our social justice advocacy and education initiatives, always looking to collaborate. Just finished a Pivot Bachelor's, likely looking for some other graduate school opportunities. I love partnering with Global Learning. I've worked with Jayne and some others before, so I look forward to this conversation. And as other people have echoed, feel free to contact me later if there are other ways that I can help you to answer any questions or enter into any experiences, or any of us, I'm pretty sure. And please check our office out. We have a lot of things coming up.
And Marquise?
Hi, everyone. I'll try to keep it short and sweet, but my name is Marquise Steward. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am in my last semester of my master's degree for higher education administration. Please wish me luck, because every day is running by quickly. I can't believe that we're almost there. I'm the current graduate assistant for the Women's Center and the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion, and I was a previous grad assistant for the Pride Center last year. So I'm really excited to have this conversation and to learn and grow with you all.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And oh, cool. Now I can see the whole full list of everybody. I see all the pinned of the panel and everybody at the top, so that's great. And I see some familiar faces here today too, so familiar names and square boxes. So it's good to see you all. And just a reminder again that our conversation is kind of jumping off of the article, The Anti-Gay Agenda in the New York Times by Charles M. Blow, who's a New York Times columnist, journalist. So yes, hi, Samantha. If you want to say hi in the chat, we are paying attention to the chat, so do engage with us. But yeah, that article, if you didn't get a chance to read it, it's really great. It's an opinion piece. We love opinion pieces because we get one person's perspective, kind of unfiltered. And I think that it covers a lot of really important areas, and it was why we came up with the title for today, which is Intersecting Isms, a discussion on racism, heterosexism, and cisgenderism. And when we talk about isms, we're often talking about ideology, which refers to a specific system, not just individual behaviors, but like a whole system of attitudes, beliefs, policies, like everything that kind of makes up a society. So with that, I wanted to ask our panelists to discuss some of the isms that we have right in the title of this talk today, and just talk about what these isms mean to you. And we're just going to start off with racism. But before we do that, I think we should launch the little poll that we have on racism and just see what our participants here today think racism is all about. We're queuing up the poll. Yeah, we said this was going to be interactive, y'all. So here we go. So what is racism? What do you mean when you speak about racism? Are you talking about systemic treatment? Talking about legislature, like things that are built into law? Are we talking about specific interpersonal interactions between others? Or is there something else that you're trying to get across when you are talking about racism? So I guess we'll leave that up for a few seconds. And maybe I'm going to leave this to Michelle to make the decision when it starts to slow, or when we reach sort of getting there to 30 participants, we can start to share the results. We're already sharing in the chat. Thank you, Julio. Julio says maybe it manifests as all of the above. Lauren says maybe that and other dimensions, Alice. I love this. It's already garnering some conversation. We love to see it. All right. Systemic treatment seems to be the winner there, but there's no, it's all these things. Let's start with Rose, because Rose put together these poll questions. I'd love to hear, what is racism from your perspective? And what do you mean when you talk about racism, and maybe a little reflection on these poll responses here?
Absolutely. So I agree with some of the attendees in the chat that it's sort of a mishmash hodgepodge of all of those factors and some other things that maybe we haven't described here. Shout out real quick to my student, Lauren. I think that it's the application of some specific structural tenets, absolutely, but it's also those things in motion. So we're holding these beliefs, we're codifying them in legislature, we're enacting them through our interactions, and we're creating this fictive thing that we are constantly interacting with and around, and then sort of reflecting back on in a way that lately, like, our conversations are illuminating, but also we end up in a space sometimes where we're talking about talking, which is a piece of it as well. That's what I think.
Any of the other panelists chime in where you'd like?
I think Rose hits it, spot on. And I think I would add that for me, it's bordering line this idea of dehumanizing, right? So not only is it systemic, but it has also been used throughout our, particularly in the Western world, being used to determine who's human and who's not. And so I kind of see it, from that perspective as well.
Anything to add, Marquise?
I just think back to like my first class for undergrad. I think it was like Black women and intercultural perspectives. And I was like, oh, you don't like this race? Like, that's racism. It's just very like cut and dry, it's very black and white. But as I look at it now, I always say it's kind of like in the pecking order. I try not to use terms like totem pole, but it's definitely to oppress certain groups based off of phenotypes. And what I feel like is like this arbitrary system of like race. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm the type of person to be like, let's eradicate that. But it's also what speaks to truth of that there is discrimination based off of what we see in a person and how they are represented. So it's always interesting to think about the term racism. I feel like it's always a hot button topic. It's always what comes first when we talk about discrimination. And I'm happy that we're talking about the intersection of them all, the isms.
Right, and racism is really about, it's any type of race. So it's any, type of race that's historically, traditionally, currently marginalized. But when we talk about just something like anti-Blackness, and this is Women's History Month, listen to me, Black History Month. What about anti-Blackness? What do we need to share about anti-Blackness, and how does that fit under this kind of broader scope of racism?
I think it goes back to what I was saying. I certainly think if some people will say that racism and anti-Blackness are two separate things. Some would say that they are intersected amongst one another. So for me, as we look at specifically anti-Blackness, I think it literally lends itself to this idea of the dehumanization, right? Or the nothingness, as one scholar would put it, that this idea of anti-Blackness means that it's nothing. And so again, throughout history, it's been easy to create, if you will, genocide against a category of people that you see as being nothing, right? And so anti-Blackness for me goes a step further even than racism. For me, at least in racism, you almost acknowledge that, the individual is human, or the community is human. Whereas in anti-Blackness, you're, in a space where you're saying, that they basically is nothing, right? There is non-human that's there.
That's interesting. I think, go ahead, Marquise.
I was gonna say, and I'm always gonna give like something that's culturally relevant. So for TikTokers, love that. You ever seen the TikTok where they're like, if you're looking at my hair, it's anti-Black? I just find it as like, it's always a joke, but I think it is those everyday experiences. I think anti-Blackness can definitely live within Black people. I think it's anything that's to the disenfranchisement of Black people. And I think that we need to look into what we really think about Black people. I remember I heard a story of someone walking across the street and they're Black and someone clutches their pearls or clutches their bag. I think it's anything that is a direct, even if it is subtle, attack on Blackness, the disdain for Blackness. And I don't know, I've been experiencing enough anti-Blackness in different areas and seeing how it manifests in different cultures. But I think it's a call for those who are Black or who don't identify as Black to look into like their true feelings, right? Get into that uncomfort for what they truly believe. And I mean, I think we're all socialized in a certain way. I'll leave that where it's at. But I think it's for us to see how we are actively allowing the Black community to be attacked on an everyday basis.
So all of you are touching on both like the systemic and also the individualized experiences of racism and anti-Blackness, like how it shows up in individuals, but also how it shows up at more of a systemic level. And I think that's like kind of an ongoing conversation within talking about isms in general, is just, you know, where does it actually show up in our everyday lives? And sometimes it's seen and it's, you know, very visible, and sometimes it's not as well seen. So moving on to heterosexism, and I know this is kind of like my wheelhouse here, so I'm going to give a little bit of an answer to my own question here, which is, you know, what is heterosexism? What do we mean by it? Again, it's kind of this this systemic, or, you know, this ideological experience of discrimination that perpetuates sexual stigma. And we say sexual stigma now, and what we mean by sexual stigma is that it has to do with like a negative regard for anything that's non-heterosexual in a society. So whether it's a person's identity as an individual, their relationships, or a whole community, anything that's non-heterosexual is kind of read, or if it's discriminated against, it's seen as sexual stigma. It's different from homophobia, because homophobia traditionally has been a label that's been used as like a category of actions that are specifically about a person's attitudes or behaviors towards a group, and for this in particular, anybody who's non-heterosexual. It is usually based in fear or disgust or something like that, but we find that term a little more limiting now, and homophobia really more has to do with this idea of sexual stigma, so we say that instead. Or sexual prejudice is probably even closer, because it has to do specifically with the individual. When we're thinking about these differences between like heterosexism and these like very like specific words around this stuff, what comes to mind for all of you, all of our panelists, in kind of observing heterosexism and how it plays out, or how you've seen it play out in various communities that you've interacted with?
For me, I feel like the retort is always this like super technical, like etymological analysis of the word homophobia. It's like no one's afraid of gay people. That's not what we're describing here. We're not screaming in the streets because rainbows are like attacking us. That's not what's happening. What's happening, I kind of wish that we were. That sounds fun. But it's those little things, those interpersonal interactions. It's those core beliefs that we don't like assess and really look at how they play out in our lived experiences. That's what we're talking about, and why I think maybe heterosexism, or that prejudice term, one, allows us to have that conversation a little bit more clearly for folks who don't have the same like skill set and ability to discuss and understand in that way, and maybe like unfortunately has to distance from that in order to be able to discuss, when it's like more of an analysis of self and our held themes, as opposed to this externalized other, which is what I feel like homophobia does. People are like, oh, those people are homophobic. No, honey, that's what you are. What we're talking about now, maybe an easier conversation to have, is if we talk about like the assumption that this is the dynamic that is natural, and this is the dynamic that is some perverse random extension that mutated from this thing that is what we expect. And I think when we can get into that place, then we can talk about those little more individual pieces that we can get into the codified legislature, the interpersonal, you know what I mean? The same treatments, but in a different lens.
I love that you just kind of started to take it towards the conversation on intersectionality and how all of these isms actually intersect. Before we get there, I want to just go over cisgenderism for everybody too, because I know that that can be a very new one for people. Heterosexism a little bit new, and then cisgenderism like very new. So this word, which you might have also heard, cissexism is another variation on this, but it's a discriminatory ideology that basically favors that process that we do of assigning a gender to other people. So whether it's a doctor doing that to somebody at birth, or you doing it just when you meet somebody and you haven't asked them what their gender identity is, and you're just basing it off of assumptions of how they look or what their name is. We're favoring that process over letting a person determine that for themselves and tell us what their gender is. So that process and heterosexism and racism, all of these things we recognize and we work with in our office. These are different forms of oppression that we talk about on a regular basis that we're always trying to integrate into our conversations with students, but also in the events that we do and how we are addressing these. And that's why we care so much about intersectionality, because we recognize not only do these things show up in individuals' lives at the intersections of individuals' own identities, but they also intersect in social justice work. So let's pop up the poll on intersectionality and see what people think intersectionality is. We've kind of been alluding to it. We're dancing around it. Okay, so what is intersectionality? Evaluation of BIPOC people over others. So that's Black, Indigenous, people of color. A response to white heteropatriarchy, another kind of combo word having to do with the reigning kind of male, also reigning kind of straight normalization in society. And then an effort to make space, I guess that's for marginalized people. So sorry that we didn't really finish that sentence there. An effort for making space for marginalized people. Or is it something else? And intersectionality is kind of like a hot button word right now. It's being used in different ways.
Plot twist. What if I meant to type was an effort to make spaces marginalized? Ooh.
Ooh, snap.
No, it's just a typo.
Could be, right? And actually, that's kind of how it's showing up in some, I would say, non-academic spaces where it's being discussed. All right, what do we got? Do we have results yet, Michelle? There we go. All right, so they understood the third one. An effort to make space for marginalized people. That was, I guess, the winner. Do you want to do another little reflection, Rozeena, on this one, since these are your polls that you put together?
Absolutely. So like you shared earlier, this is a hot button word that a lot of people are using, much like every English word at this point in our experience can just be used however you so decide, because grammar is what you make of it. The English language is what you make of it. However, I want to say in its origins, it was an attempt to, and continues to be as it expands and like reckons with itself in the time that we're in, an attempt to bring together multiple identities and call attention to the fact that you exist on these multiple planes that intersect, and that can either give you like multiple oppression points or multiple privilege points or anything along that spectrum, depending on who's the observer, right? And what the situation is and how it could be used to your benefit or detriment. However, I included that question because I think a lot of folks, unfortunately, believe it to be, what was it, pecking order? Good. The reverse pecking order of some maybe established racial, socioeconomic, political alignments in the West, I mean, I guess across the globe, really. And it doesn't have to be, it's not supposed to be some big apocalyptic turnover where now all the people at the bottom where at the top is more so making lateral all of these identities and experiences so folks can have the kind of equity that we think we're talking about. And so it's a work in progress, just because our people are a work in progress, our understanding is a work in progress. And there are some ways that people are claiming that the ideology fails. And that's true. Nothing is going to encompass all the things and do all the things correctly, but there are some really great ways that it has set precedents and begun conversations that were never begun before that. Yeah.
Thanks, Rose. And yeah, to give a little background on the origin of the term, it actually came from a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It was meant to discuss the very unique experiences of Black women, the experience that they have in society as both being Black and being a woman, separately from being Black or being a woman. And that intersection, right, that intersectional experience and having that framework for understanding it is now applied to a lot of different intersections of marginalized and oppressed identities. So it's an analytical framework that is useful for understanding people's experiences and also for, addressing these experiences in ways that actually address the reality as people exist. So when we're talking about, yeah, go ahead, David.
Eric, I was just going to say, I often also invite people to take a look at Audre Lorde or the group of women that is known as the Combahee River Collective when it comes to intersectionality. Now, while I know that, Sister Crenshaw has been, given the, I guess, the medal for coining the phrase, I also think that in the Combahee River Collective and others, we begin to see this idea of intersectionality before the phrase is actually coined. And so I'll drop it in the chat, but I would also invite people to take a look at the Combahee River Collective statement. And I think you will begin to see some of these intersectionalities at work even prior to the phrase actually being coined.
Yes, thank you for bringing up Audre Lorde, very famous Black woman lesbian poet. So all of the intersections that what we're talking about today, and then some. So when we talk about intersectionality, this is a question for the whole panel. What does intersectionality tell us about privilege and the different ways that privilege kind of operate?
There's no order here. I just keep ending up the first person. If anyone feels a way about that, I don't have to be. I really don't. I'm just real fast on the clicker. That's all.
You got it, Rose. Go ahead.
Okay. I think, I'm sorry, I spent so long thinking about that disclaimer that I don't remember the question.
Privilege within intersectionality.
Right.
What does it tell us about privilege?
Right. So when we apply an intersectional lens to the experiences of others, we realize that privilege is a much more nuanced, neurons. My brain will fire out every word that sounds like the word I want to say. That's crazy. Okay. Nuanced experiences of privilege, right? So if we take my own lived experiences as an example, I identify as a Black woman, and there are places where that holds a certain amount of power and privilege and access for me. There are other places that are well documented where it does not, in fact. However, because of the fact that we're taking on this discussion, I get to see these new spaces sort of happen around me where I can see people doing the work of trying to get from one place to the other, which is interesting and also uncomfortable and great. I'll take, for instance, like if I'm ever on public transit, I get a moment where someone's like, if I sit too far away from her, I realize how that looks. So I'm going to sit right next to her, not racist. And I'm like, what I don't want is that either. I appreciate it and I love that for you, but I don't love that you're in my lap. And that's kind of sort of like anecdotal, but a bigger lens on what that kind of looks like for a lot of us in this country to be trying to grapple with it, trying to address it, ham-fistedly making attempts, but at least we're trying to get there and we're making some sort of efforts, right? I think that it helps us to learn that privilege is not just some big, powerful, like mallet or that kind of smashes everything in that way. It can be unintentionally wielded inappropriately. It can be intentionally wielded to the benefit of others. And you can fall on the place in the pecking order where it would seem you have the most, but also still have challenges, because we're looking at all the ways that you operate, because we can't just be like cartoonish white man. No, there are some things there as well, right? And whatever you would perceive to be maybe the opposite of that, they all have challenge and privilege areas when we take people into consideration as a whole, as opposed to just these two things that you can see maybe outwardly about me.
I also think it tells us about the complexity of who we are as beings and souls. I think it tells us certainly about the complexity of this work that we do that we often call social justice. So when I think about intersectionality, and I think about that there are groups, that really don't have to think about that, right? And across the paradigm, and so we have to begin to think about what's the complexity of us, right? When we come to these conversations or in our everyday lives, and we start to want to pass judgment on certain people and their various experiences, right? We need to pause, right? And first think about the complexity of that individual and their experiences. I often tell people that, for every ism, there's an experience, there's a socialization that has happened that, traditionally causes that person to act out in a certain way, right? And certainly not excusing certain behaviors, but I think we have to pause and begin to really think through the complexity of what this really means.
Yes, thank you for that, David. That's really, really an important thing to do. And I just want to address one of the questions in the chat, which is about, I commented that the idea is not to do Oppression Olympics either. And someone asked if we can elaborate on Oppression Olympics and its impact. So yeah, I mean, what I meant, in saying that was reflecting on, Rozeena saying, one of the things that this conversation brings out is that, people have varying levels of privilege depending on the context or space that they walk into and the identities that they hold. So thank you, Rose, for sharing about, being a Black woman and that intersection for you. For me, as a white person, I can walk into a lot of spaces and have a lot of privilege around that. But if I walk into a space where, there's, nobody representing gender fluidity or my sexuality, which is fluid as well, that I can be discriminated against because of that. For Oppression Olympics, it's not about being like, okay, stacking up who's got the most oppressed identities and needs the most resources or needs the most support or whatever it might be. It's more so about just recognizing the unique experiences of every individual, including the many different identities that they represent, and showing up for and trying to be inclusive of as many people as you can in the social justice work that you do. And that's a challenge, right? It's like a constant balancing and recognizing when you're leaving somebody out and trying to bring them into the center. It's a constant kind of looking to the margins. Like that's what I feel like I'm always doing in this work. So let's just pause there. And I would love to hear reflections from the panel on that process in doing this work and that kind of constant looking to the margins that we do.
Well, I wanted to say, I feel like Oppression Olympics, I think we have to look at the other side of it. I think when we're calling out certain spaces, such as if we're talking about race and we're talking about white people, then they'll be like, all right, but I'm Jewish. All right, that's great. I think it's another way to just prove I am also oppressed, so you don't get to tell me that I'm oppressing you. And I think that is just what is this whole phenomenon of Oppression Olympics. And I think when we're talking about intersectionality, I wanted to touch on, in my mind, when I think of it, I think of a white gay man, or I think of a Black man. And I think of it's in ways where you can have privilege in certain spaces and you can also be oppressed in other ways. But I think it's the kind of the call to action where you said looking at the margins and to say, all right, I may have this privilege here. How can I utilize that to bring those who are oppressed or in some ways based off my identities? I think for me in this work, I think it's making myself uncomfortable. If I'm trying to understand all the margins, I'm also understanding that everything is changing. So I may get it today. There may be a theory today. There may be a word today, and then it may be out of date tomorrow. So I think I just try to, I don't know, put my ear to the streets, see what the community is looking for, see what they're calling for us to, not for us, well, I guess for us as a community, not like us in the office, to work on and to address. And I think to just be like, I don't even want to say malleable, but just be ready for change. I will never understand every single experience. And even though I do identify as gay and Black, and I came from Long Island, New York, I'm like, no, the world hates me. Yeah, they hate me, but they hate a lot of us in the same way. So how can we all kind of come together? I befriend a lot of people too, and I try to understand their experiences. I have, not that I look out for them in that way, but I have friends that I learned that were undocumented. I have friends who, I remember one point, showed me around their reservation. And I was like, I've never had these experiences before. What type of resources do you have or do you need? Because I'm always like resource community based. So I think just stepping into the community, stepping out of your comfort zone, that's how I look at the margins.
Thanks for that, Marquise. David? Sorry to see you went on, Mike.
Oh, yeah. Well, I thought you were going to go. I thought you wanted to pull. But I would say just one quick point to what Marquise, I think he highlights something very important, and that is we can't, I guess it's back to the complexity piece, right? We can't ever forget that none of our experiences are monolith, right? You know, just because I identify as a Black male, you know, people can't put me in a box. You can't, you know, surveillance me to a point that you try to, you know, stuff me into this corner over here. And so we have to be open to the idea that none of our experiences are monolith. And that means that we have to begin to allow people to really tell their own story before we ever, you know, think that we can begin to understand, right, where they're coming from.
Absolutely. There's no single story. That's a really great talk that we should have put that on our resource guide. But yeah, there's no single story. And it's important to not make assumptions about people and ask about their experiences and then find out what it is they need as an individual. And then I also was thinking how, you know, when we're looking to the margins, you know, we listed 3 isms today, because I think those are a lot of the isms that we represent on this panel and that we, you know, work with a lot, but there's so many more, right? There's ableism that we're not talking about here today. You know, there's so many more that we could have brought into this conversation too. And I think just being mindful that, that we don't know everything and it's okay. But if you're open to it and you're trying to make space for people, like that's the best thing that you can do. Yes, the danger of a single story. Michelle, I think you direct message that to me if you want to share it to the whole group. That would be awesome. I want to shift gears a little bit. We can always come back to this, or anybody can jump on and say whatever they want. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the New York Times article and the subject matter that it brought up specifically. So let's discuss Blow's questions that he poses right there in the article about why straight men can't stop obsessing about gay people. And why is it that like a thing that really has nothing to do with them occupies so much of their time and energy? And then I'll follow that with, and you know, what can we do about that? How can we address that? And I pose this to everybody too. If there are students who would like to reflect in the chat, we can comment on that as well. Or come on, Mike, be bold. Let's go. Well, I guess I can start off with the conversation just by saying that I think it has to do with a lot of the expectations and restrictions that we put on young men growing up, a bit of that toxic masculinity conversation and the heteropatriarchy, as we saw that word earlier. I think the limitations that are put and placed on men do contribute to this kind of obsessing about gay people, because it's challenging to have that around you when, you know, within yourself or within your childhood, even if you're not gay, even if you weren't, you know, destined, or that's part of your identity that you're hiding or something like that, there's still an experience of control that happens when you're younger as a man. And that can, be a kind of form of trauma in a way. And so, and from my perspective, hurt people. And I think growing up with that kind of pain of being kind of squashed into a box, even if it worked out for you in the end, that process is painful and it can come out in painful ways towards others later in life.
Eric, I think you're spot on. I think for me, I think it evolves around socialization and how one has been socialized. I think it stems from this idea of hypermasculinity that we often see play out in our society. And as you're growing up, again, so for me, and you all know this, I often tell my story about, at some point in my life where I was very homophobic, but, I grew up in a tradition, what I would call probably traditional African-American family, with traditional men who, would point out that, boys don't cry and you don't, allow these kinds of feelings or emotions to come out. And so I think there's a certain curiosity, right, to difference, right? And so as a cisgender heterosexual male, there can be this curiosity of, how does, for instance, a gay man, right, play out in his life or in their life in certain aspects, right? And you want to keep. And then the other piece is, again, from that space of surveillance, right? I think it's this idea that there's a curiosity about the gay community because folks want to, surveil the community to keep kind of pulse on what's happening, right? So I think the article itself, right, is brilliantly titled The Anti-Gay Agenda, which is a kind of reverse look at what, other, I guess you could say heterosexual or cisgender people would say, what is the gay agenda, right? That they're always talking about. So I love that Charles Blow, kind of reframes that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are our thoughts on this kind of recent attention that we've seen to celebrities, and in particular Black celebrities, having these really, kind of sexual stigma coming out in the news? What are some of our thoughts?
I have personal opinions. I feel like it's interesting that when it comes to Black individuals making comments like this, like how we'll sensationalize it compared to if it's another race, because let a Black man slip up once, and that will be the news headliner for the next 5 weeks. So I'm just like, again, it's that Black trauma that we just like to perpetuate and capitalize off of. But I would say ultimately we do have a responsibility, right, for our words and for our actions. And I think if we're speaking about the articles, we're talking about like DaBaby, we're talking about Boosie. For me, you said before, how do we kind of handle it? I ignore them. I was not really a fan anyways. I kind of move on. That's the privilege I have, but I do understand too that there are certain comments that can be made, such as "that's so gay," that may just seem like it's harmless, but it's really not. At the end of the day, you're putting someone in danger. So my thoughts on the situation are that our community needs healing. We need our Black men to stand up and not just stand up for the community, stand up for themselves, because I think we're only going to be able to save ourselves. Only reason why I brought up Black men is just because DaBaby and Boosie are Black men, but as Black individuals, and I think it needs to be something where we need to challenge our thoughts. I see that there's also an example of like Gabrielle Union and Julie Reid, right, and their family, and Zaria, their daughter. So I think it's like, again, we may not understand everything, but everything is changing. So try to like lead with love and understanding. But yeah, I mean, I ignore those tools. I'm not gonna lie. If I just see something stupid, I'm like, I could care less, just because I've been in my identities, I've stand strong in them for so long. But speak to, people that you see are in your community that you can look up to, whether mentors, working at the university here, if you don't feel comfortable, because we can stand in solidarity together. And that's also someone else's problem. I paralleled it to kind of like, because we're in South Florida, we're in Miami, I would say there's a lot of immigrants, right? People migrating. And sometimes it's the person who's here and they get their papers, whatever that situation may be, and then they look back and say, well, you over there, like, no, like, you're an immigrant. What do you mean? You know, you're stealing resources. Like, whoa, wait a minute. We're all on this boat together. Let's try to help each other. Things did not just switch up just because you may be a Black man in success. You know, you have to understand that there's this, maybe there's parallels through different groups, but there's always going to be like this othering of us all, even if you think you've made it.
I appreciate that you said that it, you know, you just ignore them, that it doesn't affect you. And like, that's a, you know, obviously if you're not already a fan, then it doesn't affect you as much. But something that I like to do as well is like not draw more attention than is necessary, because that just gives it more airtime. And number two, I tried to, like, I love Lil Nas X and what Lil Nas X is doing. So I just try to uplift and be louder about Lil Nas X than about the problem, you know, of what the baby is saying in the news.
But I also think, as Marquise said, I think it's an education opportunity, right? Particularly within personal relationships. And certainly while, you know, I would never support it, I also think that, you know, particularly for Black men, from a historical context, I would invite people to also understand, and I would say historically from African-American, certainly Caribbean, this idea historically back to slavery, right? This idea of buck breaking was, you know, this idea that, you know, slave masters would literally break, what they would call bucks in front of their families, the entire enslaved community, if you will. And so out of that developed this kind of disdain for homosexual activity, because, you know, that was quietly kept sometimes within slavery, but that the slave masters not only slept with females that they enslaved, but also the men or males that they enslaved. And so it's certainly an educational opportunity on both sides, right? To educate particularly men that have those feelings and thoughts, but it's also an opportunity to educate a community and say, well, here's probably where some of that comes from. So let's intertwine that into the conversation as well.
Absolutely. It's healing all of the trauma of the past and processing that and taking those moments to do that when these things come up, because it's going to be the re-experiencing of it over and over again if we don't. So I appreciate that. And yeah, I think education, we're all educators here. So education is definitely the way we all like to go about this. I see that we have 6 minutes left. So I just wanted to look to Michelle and Sherry and see, do we do like a few minutes of questions? Maybe we just shut up for a little bit. And like, if anyone wants to throw some questions at us, we can do those for a couple of minutes and then wrap up.
Yeah, I don't want to stop, but definitely if anybody has questions, please bring them.
And we know this is a hard conversation to have. We recognize that, but just know, like, we are giving you all the grace. Like, this is the time to ask those questions. We have us here to support you. And if you don't feel comfortable in the space, we're still here to support you after this.
Could we open it up for if someone had like a specific question for Rozeena or Erica, just to ask privately, and then we'll say a private question was sent, or Michelle or Sherry, whoever.
I think all of those options work. If you have a question that you want to ask specifically to someone, I can double check that the permissions in the chat allow you to, but I'm fairly certain they do.
Yeah, you can send something direct, so it's anonymous. If you send it just to me, I can always just deal it out to everybody too. So in the meantime, as we're waiting for some questions, I just wanted to bring it back to something we were talking about earlier. Glow says in the article that the isms all branch from the same tree. What is the tree? What is the tree?
I would wager to say that the tree is kind of a combination of the things that we've been discussing earlier, this sort of othering, dehumanizing, devaluation, consistently, that as a viewpoint, and then just feeding whatever kind of identity you come across into it. So women less than, gay folks less than, anyone who has a different, neurotypical or neuroatypical experience less than, and that continued feeding that into that is going to branch off into these different isms, and someone has to be othered or less than, someone has to be exploited or have a boot on their neck in order for someone else to have this position of advantage or privilege. That consistent consideration, I think, is the tree, but and I think the branches are like a good metaphor, but I really feel like it's a vehicle because it takes certain people someplace. It is rooted in things, but it does elevate and take certain people to the destination they want to get to and leaves a lot of other people behind.
All right. I love that explanation, Rose. And then I see that there's a lot of questions coming in the chat. Yay. And we have 3 minutes. So David, do you want to quick explain why you like advantaged over privileged? Why is that? Come on, Mike. It's okay, I did it earlier.
Sorry. Yeah, and for me, in terms of the tree, and I just have to be, for me, it stems around white, and we could even put male supremacy in that, right? And for that is the reason why I sometimes prefer advantage over privilege is this idea, again, historically looking at, there was this advantage, right, that certain groups, right, had. That group, more often than not, has been white males, Christian identifying males, if you want to go all the way. And so, yeah, so this idea, for me, about the advantage. The other thing is that, for some people, it's a little bit softer on the palate, right? And they can, they can see being advantaged more than being privileged or entertain that conversation. So it's just another way to say the same thing.
Awesome. All right. And how would we be able to better communicate and educate the FI community on this subject matter?
I had something I want to share. On TikTok, it's like the girls who get it, and the girls who don't. So I like to be connected with people that like, all right, if you're a 5 out of 10, I'll try to talk to you and try to get you to the point where you can be like a 6 or 7. And then I push you on to go and share my story the best way you can, because I can't talk to everyone and I'm going to become exhausted at some point. So I think that has been a strategy for me, but also taking some breaks, realizing that we all didn't just wake up one day and was like, I got it. I understand everything. Like we had to learn a lot and we're all growing. So just giving yourself that grace and that patience.
That's great. I think that you hit 2 questions with 1 answer there. So that was awesome. When will the labeling stop? Is there going to be a point where we're going to stop classifying people? I think that's really interesting because some of the resources that we shared with you actually talk about this, about how racism and all these isms, they stem from somewhere because we categorize the way that we do. And those categories are important to this moment, but there is no racism without race, and you have to create race and racialize to create racism. So yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't know if my colleagues have any reflections before we end on that.
To answer the education and the labeling question, I think trying to trap 2 birds with 1 stone, just consistently be asking yourself who benefits. Who benefits from me thinking this way, acting this way, treating these people this way? Is it actually me, or does it serve some greater big bad? You know what I mean? Who benefits from this being published? What agenda does this piece of writing serve? Who does this support? What identities does this push down? Because there's always somebody.
I love that. Yes, asking those questions. That I think asking questions and then listening is great. Those are really great tips moving forward from this conversation. Please interact with us in the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion. We are at an MMC on the Graham Center, 2nd floor, 216, and at BBC Wolf University Center, 2nd floor, 255. We are available to you on Instagram at FIU_OSJI, and our website is osji.fiu.edu. And yeah, we really enjoyed this. Thank you so much to Michelle and Sherry for helping to organize this today. Appreciate you so, so much. And thank you all for listening to us.
Thank you all for being here and leading this discussion. Such important work and great connections to resources, a fantastic community here at FIU. So if you haven't already, reach out, get connected. The resources are there for you, and the community is wonderful and growing exponentially. So thank you so much for your work. I'm gonna quick applause. Go ahead and